April 1945. The war in Europe was ending, but for thousands of captured Germans a new kind of fear had just begun. Propaganda had told them that capture by Americans meant starvation, humiliation, maybe even death. To be taken by the enemy was to vanish behind barbed wire and never return. So when a young German nurse named Greta Hoffmann stepped into a US-run prisoner camp that cold spring morning, her hands shook. She expected punishment. She expected cruelty. What she got instead was breakfast. On a metal tray, still steaming from the kitchen, lay 2 golden eggs, 3 strips of bacon, and a slice of toast spread thick with butter so yellow it almost glowed in the morning light. She froze. This couldn't be real. Prisoners weren't supposed to eat like this. Across the room, other women stared in disbelief. They had heard stories of Soviet camps of hunger so deep it erased names. But here, in an American facility surrounded by fences and guards, they were being served the same meal as the soldiers who guarded them. And as the smell of bacon filled the mess hall, something subtle began to shift. Greta remembered the Nazi officers who had told them that Americans were savages, uneducated cowboys who hated Germans. Yet here they were, treating their enemies with dignity. Every bite of that breakfast felt like a question. What if everything they had believed was a lie? What if mercy was more powerful than revenge? This is the true, forgotten story of how a simple breakfast, served in a prison camp at the end of the world's deadliest war, would shake beliefs, blur the line between enemies and humans, and leave both captors and captives questioning what it really means to be civilized. Because sometimes the most dangerous weapon in war isn't a gun or a bomb, it's kindness. You're watching WWII Frontline. If you believe the smallest acts can change the course of history, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because this story will change how you see the end of World War II forever. The last days of the Third Reich were chaos. Roads once filled with marching boots were now flooded with refugees, wounded soldiers, and terrified civilians clutching whatever they could carry. In that confusion, Greta Hoffmann, a Red Cross nurse, was captured near Kassel along with 50 other women, clerks, auxiliaries, radio operators, once proud servants of a vanished army. They were herded into trucks marked with white stars, engines growling through the ruined countryside. Every rumor they had ever heard echoed in their minds. The Americans humiliate their prisoners. They take revenge. Some prayed. Some stared at the horizon, already imagining the camps of horror that Nazi radio had described. When the convoy finally stopped at dawn, the women were silent. Ahead stood rows of wooden barracks surrounded by wire, but the air was strangely calm. No shouting, no dogs, only the creak of a flagpole in the wind. A guard tower watched over the compound, yet the faces that looked down from it were young, weary, and most unsettling of all, ordinary. Inside the gate, Sergeant William Carter read from a clipboard, his Midwestern accent sharp against the morning chill. Name, occupation, age. The process was quick, efficient, impersonal. But when one woman stumbled, he reached out instinctively to steady her. No one laughed. No one struck her. Greta noticed that gesture and stored it away like a spark of confusion. That night they slept on clean straw mattresses. Thin but clean, and in the distance, somewhere beyond the fences, came the smell of something frying. Rich, unfamiliar, almost intoxicating. It teased them through their hunger and fear until sleep finally came. Morning arrived cold and colorless. The prisoners lined up outside a long building labeled Mess Hall C. The sign alone felt mocking. Mess hall, as if this were a school, not captivity. Inside, metal trays clattered, steam rose, and an impossible aroma filled the room. When Greta reached the front of the line, Sergeant Carter stood there again. Next, he said, voice flat. A ladle, a motion, and then the plate appeared. 2 fried eggs, bacon crisp at the edges, toast with a square of butter melting into gold. She hesitated. Carter met her eyes. Eat, he said quietly. You'll need your strength. It wasn't an order, it was concern. Greta carried the tray to a long wooden table where the others sat frozen in disbelief. For a moment, no one touched the food. Then somewhere down the row, a fork scraped against enamel. One woman began to eat. Another followed. And soon the mess hall filled not with fear, but with the small, fragile sounds of people rediscovering hunger. Outside, the flag above the camp snapped in the wind. Inside, something far larger than breakfast had begun. Because in that room of supposed enemies, the first cracks were appearing in the walls that war had built. Days turned into a quiet rhythm. Each morning began with a metallic clang of the breakfast bell, and the smell that had first shocked them all: bacon, coffee, warm bread. The women still lined up in silence, but the terror that once hung over them had softened into uneasy curiosity. Inside the American POW camp, everything was ruled by order, a strange, humane kind of order. The guards checked roll call with calm voices. They gave clear instructions, no shouting, no threats. Even punishment was rare. The Geneva Convention posters pinned to the barrack walls in English and German promised rights the women had never expected to possess. Humane treatment, medical care, correspondence with family. At first, none of them believed it. They expected the illusion to shatter, that any kindness was simply bait before cruelty. But it didn't. Day after day, they were treated not like enemies, but like humans. Greta watched the Americans closely. She noticed the small things, the way Sergeant Carter adjusted his uniform sleeves before serving, how he always made sure every tray was full, even when supplies ran low. He never smiled much, but there was something in his eyes, the look of a man who had seen too much death and refused to add more to his memory. On the third morning, Greta whispered to Liesel, the young telegraph operator beside her. "They eat the same food we do." Liesel frowned, still skeptical. Maybe it's a trick, but the trick never came. When a guard accidentally spilled a pot of coffee and burned his hand, Greta's instinct as a nurse took over. She ran forward, earning gasps from the other prisoners. Approaching a guard without permission was dangerous. But Carter stopped her only long enough to ask, "You know medicine?" She nodded. "Then do what you can." That small moment changed everything. By the end of the week, the American doctor had asked Greta to assist in the infirmary. Under supervision, she cleaned wounds of both American and German. It was surreal. The same hands that once bandaged Wehrmacht soldiers now tended to Allied guards. The thin line between enemy and caretaker blurred until it almost disappeared. The other prisoners noticed too. The guards started leaving newspapers in the common room. English books appeared, old novels, magazines, even a Bible. In the evenings, Carter and Corporal James Murphy, the youngest of the guards, sometimes talked near the fence about home, farms, families, and fields far away. Greta would listen quietly, the words foreign yet oddly comforting, and then came the moment that changed her most. One afternoon, Murphy collapsed outside the infirmary, pale and trembling. Greta rushed to him immediately. His pulse was weak, his hands cold. "Low blood sugar," she muttered, recognizing the signs from her hospital years in Berlin. She reached into her apron, found a scrap of bread and a spoonful of jam she had saved, and pressed it to his lips. Murphy obeyed, too weak to resist. Within minutes, color returned to his face. He looked at her, bewildered. "Why would you help me?" She answered softly. "Because you're not my enemy right now. You're a man who needs help." That evening, Sergeant Carter passed her in silence, but his eyes carried something new: respect. The next morning, when Greta entered the mess hall, the eggs were still warm, the coffee strong, but something invisible had changed. The prisoners no longer ate in silence. Someone laughed softly at a shared joke. A guard held the door for a woman carrying plates. The world hadn't healed, but for a few hours each day, it felt like it could. And every morning, as the golden yolks shone under the light, Greta realized the truth she'd never dared imagine. Sometimes, the smallest kindness in captivity can feel more revolutionary than freedom itself. It began with a telegram. Sergeant Carter received it one gray morning in late April. His face tightened as he read, then folded the paper and walked briskly toward the command office. The guards exchanged glances. The usual lightness and the small talk, the quiet radio music from the mess hall, faded. Something had changed. The next day, the tone of the camp shifted. The soldiers no longer lingered when serving meals. The smiles, the polite nods, gone. The air felt heavier, colder. Even the smell of breakfast couldn't hide the tension. Greta noticed it instantly. She had learned to read faces during the war. And the Americans' faces now carried something new. Not anger, not fear, but horror. Later that afternoon, Corporal Murphy came to the infirmary, his hands shaking as he carried a bundle of papers. He said nothing, simply dropped them on the table before her and left. Greta waited until the door closed before opening them. Photographs. Black and white. Grainy. Impossible. Bodies stacked like firewood. Children's shoes in piles. A gate with words she could barely read. Arbeit macht frei. Her stomach turned. She wanted to look away, but couldn't. These were German camps. Her country's camps. She had heard rumors, of course. Whispers among soldiers, quiet sentences cut short. But nothing could prepare her for this. When Carter entered the room moments later, Greta could see it in his eyes. He knew she had seen them. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, he asked, "You didn't know?" Greta shook her head. "I was a nurse," she said weakly. "We heard rumors, but not this." Her voice broke. "I didn't want to believe." Carter turned away, fists clenched. "I've seen battlefields, Greta, but not like this." The room was silent except for the hum of the single bulb above them. From that day, the fragile peace inside the camp began to unravel. The guards avoided eye contact. The easy routine of the mess hall turned stiff and mechanical. The women felt it. The invisible wall rising again between captor and captive. Liesl wept that night. "They'll think we knew," she whispered. "That we all agreed to it." Anna Coe, the older woman, simply stared into the darkness. "Maybe we did," in silence. "Maybe that's enough." Greta lay awake, haunted by the images, by the faces that would never see another sunrise. She thought of the Americans, of their quiet decency, their breakfast rituals, the laughter they'd shared. How could those same men look at her now without disgust? How could she look at herself? The next morning, Carter's voice was sharp during roll call. "All prisoners prepare for transfer. Orders from higher command." The words struck like gunfire. Transferred, everyone knew what it meant. A punishment facility, hard labor, no more bacon, no more coffee, no more dignity. Greta's heart pounded. Murphy avoided her eyes as they passed in the yard. The man she had once saved now walked past her like a ghost. As night fell, the camp was wrapped in silence, broken only by the distant rumble of trucks being fueled. Liesl sat on her bunk, clutching a scarf. "It's over," she said softly. "They hate us again." Greta didn't answer. She looked at her hands, the same hands that had bandaged American wounds, that had held jam to Murphy's lips, and wondered if they could ever wash away the guilt of what those photographs revealed. Outside, the wind tore at the flagpole. Inside, a silence heavier than any chain settled over the women. The kindness that had once felt like redemption now seemed impossible, a dream too fragile to survive the weight of truth. The night before the transfer, the camp did not sleep. Engines idled in the yard, their low growl seeping through the barrack walls like distant thunder. 50 women sat on their bunks, clutching the small bags they'd been told to pack. One blanket, one change of clothes, one memory each. Greta's hands trembled as she folded the letter she had never managed to send. "Meine liebste Schwester," it began. "I am alive, but I no longer know who the enemy is." Now the paper felt pointless. The trucks outside would carry her away before it ever reached Berlin. Across the compound, Sergeant Carter sat at his desk beneath the dim yellow lamp. On the table lay 2 piles of paper, the official transfer orders, and the report he had begun to write hours earlier, but could not finish. Each line of military ink seemed to drag him deeper into a moral fog. He had followed every rule, served his country with discipline, yet tonight those same rules demanded that he deliver people he had shared coffee with, to a place built for punishment. When Corporal Murphy entered, his face was pale, his cap clutched in both hands. "Sir," he said quietly, "the trucks are ready." Carter didn't look up. "You've seen the orders." "Yes, sir." A pause. "They don't deserve this." Carter exhaled slowly, the sound more like a sigh than anger. "You saw the photographs, Murphy. The world's changed now." Murphy swallowed. "The world changed long before those pictures, sir. We just didn't notice." Silence settled again, thick, unbearable. Then Carter pushed the unfinished report aside. "What kind of men?" he asked, almost to himself. "Do we become when kindness is treated as weakness?" Outside, a single searchlight swept across the yard, cutting through mist and wire. Its beam slid over Greta's face as she stood near the window waiting. She could see Murphy approaching, his steps hesitant, his eyes red from sleeplessness. He stopped at the fence, close enough for her to hear his whisper. "They're moving you at dawn," Greta nodded. "I know." Murphy gripped the wire. "It shouldn't end like this." Greta's voice was steady. "It doesn't have to." Her words followed him back to the office like a haunting. At 4 a.m., Carter gathered the guards. "We carry out the transfer at first light," he said, but his tone lacked conviction. The men exchanged uncertain looks. They could feel the fracture between duty and conscience widening. When dawn finally arrived, the first truck rattled forward. The women climbed aboard silent, their eyes hollow. Greta was among the last to step up. She turned once, searching the yard for Carter. He appeared at the doorway of the command office, a folded paper in hand. "Hold the convoy," he ordered. The driver froze mid-motion. Carter crossed the yard, each step deliberate. He handed Murphy the paper. "Read it," he said. Murphy unfolded it and began aloud, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "The German prisoners under my supervision have provided assistance of medical and linguistic value. Their cooperation has contributed to camp health and to post-combat assessments. Recommendation: retain selected individuals for further service in refugee processing." The yard went still. Every soldier understood what this meant. Carter had rewritten the story. He had turned compassion into strategy. Major Brennan arrived minutes later, confusion etched on his face. "What is this, Carter?" "Intelligence asset report, sir," Carter replied crisply. "They're useful to us, especially the nurse." Brennan studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "Fine, half stay. The rest move on." And just like that, a bureaucratic miracle saved lives. As the trucks rolled out, Greta remained behind the fence, eyes glistening. Carter met her gaze briefly but said nothing. He didn't need to. The act had spoken louder than any apology. In a war built on hatred, he had risked everything for the smallest rebellion imaginable: mercy. The morning after the transfer was different. Half the barracks stood empty, their bunks neatly folded, their silence louder than any marching order. For the women who remained, the camp felt hollow, like a house after a storm, standing but forever changed. Greta sat by the window of the infirmary, staring at the frost forming delicate patterns on the glass. Outside, the guards moved slower than usual, their voices hushed. No one laughed. Even the flag on the pole hung limp in the windless dawn. When the bell finally rang for breakfast, she hesitated. The mess hall had always been a strange sanctuary, a place where fear met mercy, where the smell of bacon meant another day alive. But this morning she wasn't sure she could face it. Still, habit pulled her there. Inside, the air was warm, thick with steam from the stoves. Metal trays clattered against wooden tables. For a fleeting moment, she could almost pretend nothing had changed. Then she saw Sergeant Carter standing at the serving line. He looked older. The hard angles of duty still framed his face, but the weight of his choice lingered behind his eyes. He held a single tray in his hands. Not the standard tin, but a clean white plate, one of the few kept for officers. He motioned for her to step forward. "Ma'am," he said formally, though his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "You missed breakfast yesterday." Greta blinked, unsure how to respond. Her throat felt tight. Carter nodded toward the plate. "So I saved you one." She glanced down, and there it was again. 2 perfectly fried eggs, their yolks golden and trembling in the light. 3 crisp strips of bacon. Toast, still warm, spread thick with real butter. The same meal that had once frightened her. The same meal that had made her question everything. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Carter set the tray on the table between them. "No orders," he said quietly. "No reports. Just breakfast." Greta's fingers trembled as she reached for the fork. "Why?" she whispered. "After everything, why still this kindness?" Carter stared at the floor. "Because the world's about to forget it matters." Outside, the trucks that had carried the others away were gone. The sound of engines had faded into distance, replaced by the soft hiss of the stove. The smell of bacon filled the room, wrapping the moment in a warmth that neither could explain. Greta took her first bite slowly. The taste was the same: salt, smoke, butter, but now it carried a weight far heavier than hunger. It was the taste of survival, of choices that defied uniform and nation. Across from her, Carter folded his hands, silent. When she finished, he picked up the plate and said, "You should write that letter now. It'll get through." She looked up, startled. "You'll send it?" He nodded once. "I'll make sure of it." She opened the folded paper in her pocket, smoothing the creases. The words came easier this time. "My dearest sister, I am alive. They do not starve us here. They feed us as they feed their own. The men who guard us speak kindly and treat us like people. Perhaps that is what peace looks like. Strangers remembering they share the same hunger." When she finished, Carter took the letter, slipped it into his jacket, and saluted her, not as a prisoner but as a fellow survivor of a war neither had truly wanted. As she turned to leave, Greta looked once more at the table where the plate had sat. A faint ring of butter marked the wood, a small shining circle that would fade by evening like every trace of that impossible breakfast. But the memory would remain. Because sometimes history isn't written by those who fought hardest, but by those who refused to stop seeing the humanity in their enemies. Summer 1945. The war was over, but the world felt heavier than ever. Germany lay in ruins. Cities were reduced to bones of stone and silence. Millions searched for homes that no longer existed, and even victory tasted like ash. In one small camp on the edge of the American zone, 50 names were crossed off the roster. Some had been transferred, some released, some simply vanished into the bureaucratic fog that always follows war. Greta Hoffman's name, too, was gone from the list. The nurse who had once walked through those gates in fear was now somewhere between captivity and freedom, carrying with her a story the world would never think to ask. Sergeant Carter stayed on for a few more months, overseeing the camp's closure. Each morning, when he stepped into the empty mess hall, he saw ghosts, laughter over breakfast, the scrape of forks, the hesitant smiles of women learning that kindness could exist even behind wire. The tables were bare now, but sometimes the smell of coffee seemed to linger in the wood. One afternoon, he opened a worn envelope addressed from Berlin. Inside was a short letter written in careful German, the ink slightly blurred. "Sergeant Carter, my sister's letter reached us. She is safe. She wrote of the breakfast, of your mercy, of the day she stopped believing in monsters. You should know you changed something inside her and perhaps inside all of us. Thank you." He folded it gently, staring at the words until they blurred into the sunlight. Then he placed the letter between the pages of his Bible and closed it. Years later, historians would record numbers: 6 million dead here, 2 million displaced there, but nowhere in those ledgers was room for the taste of bacon and eggs in a cold spring morning of 1945. No archive could capture the way mercy had looked that day, or how it had sounded when a German prisoner and an American sergeant spoke to each other like human beings instead of enemies. Because history, for all its dates and documents, often forgets the smallest revolutions, the quiet, decent moments when hatred hesitated and humanity took its place. And maybe that's what Greta carried back with her to Berlin. Not guilt, not even forgiveness, but proof that goodness could survive the wreckage. She would spend the rest of her life as a nurse. Again, this time rebuilding, not patching wounds torn by bombs. When her children asked about the war, she never spoke of battles. She spoke of a breakfast that changed everything. As the camera fades from the ruins to a modern skyline, the narration slows. The war taught the world many lessons. Some were carved in stone and blood. But the quietest one, the one too soft for textbooks, is that mercy is never wasted. Even when it changes nothing around you, it changes something within you. Pause. The music swells strings, low and mournful, then lifting, because sometimes the strongest thing a soldier can do is to serve breakfast to his enemy. And mean it. If this story moved you, remember it isn't just about one nurse or one sergeant. It's about what people are capable of, even after the worst of wars. Subscribe to WWII Frontline for more untold stories that prove humanity can survive even the darkest chapters of history. And tell us in the comments, do you think kindness is strength or weakness when the world is falling apart? Because as Greta Hoffman once learned behind the barbed wire of 1945, sometimes a warm meal can heal a colder war than bullets ever could.